Greetings. Today I'd like to talk to you about DevContainers and GitHub Codespaces. So the problem, fundamentally, is that development environments can be a challenge to set up, and it really slows onboarding of new developers. We got to manage the requirements and dependencies, and that can be different for each OS and even versions of OS. Moving from one Mac to another or new Windows updates can change things. It's really hard to test library upgrades if you want to move to, say, a new version of Ruby or a new version of .NET, but then downgrade afterwards. It can be complicated to go forward and backwards. Usually easy to upgrade, pretty hard to downgrade. And then having consistent environments to enable repeatable results so that you know that every developer in your group is seeing and testing the same thing. The kind of the standard flow we get when developers join our company is that they onboard, they start to configure package managers. That can be things like Brew or Aptitude, Chocolatey for Windows, pip3, Yarn, npm, Snap, etc., etc., etc. We then have all the OS dependencies. We have ports we got to open and make sure that we can expose. We set up VisualStudio Code or some other IDE. We'll get our git clone repo, and we have to have git credentials and, well, all the fun with YubiKeys on that one. Build locally, and then we have external dependencies that we got to deal with. Maybe we have to test a database or see an endpoint. Then finally, we can run the latest code if all goes well. And some of those external dependencies are things like databases, properties, configs, secrets. The thing about OS dependencies and package managers, they're always changing. I have this trouble personally with some Ruby-based projects where Ruby just keeps moving forward. If you do Ruby full on the latest OS, that can change from 2 to 3 and 3 to 3 dot something. Same with Python. So with dev containers, which are Dockerized containers running in Visual Studio Code, the process is greatly simplified. We onboard our developer. They set up Docker. They set up Visual Studio Code. They clone their repo, and it'll prompt them to run a container, and then they can run and test. All their dependencies are built and saved for them. And in dev containers, I should point out the first time you launch, it's a little slow because it will build the container based on the Docker file. But then subsequent runs until you change the Docker file, reuse the image, so it's much, much faster. In GitHub Codespaces, we simplify it even quicker. So with GitHub Codespaces, we onboard a developer, make sure they have access to GitHub. They go to the GitHub repo and click Run in a code space, and they're done. It launches, and it's set up, and they can start to test their code right away. It's about as simple as we possibly can get. So let's kind of talk about Codespaces, Copilot, and the various tools out here. So assuming we have our code in a GitHub repo, we launch a GitHub Codespace, which is going to actually launch it somewhere in Azure. It's a ephemeral container. And that container is based on your dev container spec. And that includes Code Server, which is the Visual Studio Code hosted instance that you see. It's called Code Server. Now, if I'm paying for it myself, it's $4 a month. It can be bundled in with other accounts. We have it here at WellSky. Codespaces and Copilot are different things. So Copilot is the AI tooling. That's $10 a month if I want to pay out of pocket. We have Copilot as well here at WellSky. But I want to make sure that you know that the two are different. Codespaces comes with GitHub Pro. Copilot is an add-in on top of that. Project IDX is from Google, and it does actually come with Gemini Code Assist, and that's free. And so they're not charging for now, and that's a hosted container in Google Cloud. If you want to pay for the equivalent to Copilot, Duet API, or Duet AI, it could be $15 a month. But I can tell you personally, because I use it personally, and I have it tied into a billing account personally, I'm not charged even today. So the equivalent of Copilot in Google is still free today. And lastly, dev containers are a feature of Visual Studio Code. There is no charge for that. That's just a feature of the app. And here you can see that Codespace can just go to GitHub repos. But whether I'm doing a dev container or Google Cloud, in a hacky kind of way, I can use other code repositories, such as Forjo, Gitea, Codeberg, Azure repos, GitLab, etc., etc. So look at kind of the interface. So when I want to launch Project IDX on Google, we kind of see the left-hand window. I pick a workspace or create a new one where I authenticate to GitHub, and I pick what kind of app, it's going to be Python or Ruby or Node.js or .NET. On the right, you can see that I can launch a code space, and in this case, I already have one defined, so I'm just going to open it in a browser from the right-click menu. It's usually on that code on the left-hand side local, you'll get your git clone things. You see a code space tab that lets you do code spaces, and I'm going to open it in a browser. Once we open it, it's very similar. Now, I have hacked my project IDX a bit, so you're actually seeing a Gatia repo that I self-host in my own Kubernetes, but the idea is the same here. We have code server left and right. They're both essentially running Visual Studio Code with all the features you would expect. And really the only difference you can see here, and I'll use the mouse, is the GitHub logo here and the Project IDX one there. The Project IDX one here and the GitHub logo here. So next, we see we have running dev containers versus code spaces. So with dev containers and code spaces, they're actually running the same thing. We have a dev container JSON, which defines some basic configuration. And in both cases, I say use the relative file for Docker file. And here I can see the Docker file here, and it's the same Docker file here. And so they're both running the same set of code. And the way that I know I'm in a dev container as opposed to just launching Visual Studio Code locally is seeing that root and the SHA name tells me I'm not actually on my Windows subsystem for Linux instance here. So let's look at a little demo of running it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Codespaces, and here I can see one that's already running, and I'll open in browser. Now, if it's been archived, it's been a long time and it's stopped, it'll have to start that container. It takes a little bit longer, but this is as fast as it is. Again, this is live recording. I didn't slow it down or speed it up. And now I can go ahead and launch my Ruby app. So here I do bundle exec jekyll serve, which will compile 3 years of blog entries and then run the Jekyll app to serve up traffic. Now this does take a minute. It takes a minute when I'm doing it locally. So I'll pause it probably right here at this step and then restart it. Now it's done. We open in container, it prompts you. It saw that a port was open. And now it's launched the last iteration, the last time I synced this repo. Here's a version of the site. Now, how does dev containers work? It's very, very similar. So here what we're going to do is I'm going to do Visual Studio Code. Now, at first, this launches Visual Studio Code locally, as you'd expect. But what it's going to do is it's going to prompt me there on the bottom right to say, hey, you want to open that in a container? And I'll say yes, and it'll close that window and reopen Visual Studio Code. But this time you notice it says opening remote and it's running in container. Now this container is actually local. It's on my computer. It's running in Docker Hub or Docker Desktop. But you can see that root and it's running, and I do bundle exec jekyll serve. And it was very fast to launch this container because it's already compiled that Docker file at least once on my laptop and I haven't changed it. I will say that it can take, for me anyway, upwards of 5 to 10 minutes to make that container the first time, just because I have a ton of dependencies. But once made, it reuses it over and over and over. And now you can see, again, another copy of the site at a point in time. Let's look at Project IDX. So this one, I'm going to go ahead and open up the same Jekyll blog that I've opened before. And here's opening up code server on a container in Google. And what I got to do here is do terminal, because I already hacked this around to clone from a Gatia repo instead of my actual GitHub. So I'll go back to my GitHub repo, and it's actually launching code that way. It knows to do it contextually inside of IDX. I'm going to relaunch it. It will prompt me to rebuild the environment, but I'm fine leaving it the way it was. It was fine before. It's just detecting the IDX file has changed. I can now do a terminal and do bundle exec jekyll serve. Now this is going to be an old copy of the blog just because I haven't done a git update. You'll notice it's picking bundler, right? This image isn't based on the dev container. It's just based on a generic code container in an environment. So I have to tell it, yes, I want the Ruby bundler, bring in Ruby and all that entails, and it will now launch it. So there's a little bit of work here. Now it saves the container It kind of archives it and then brings it out of archive. I've had it go several months, and then it just kind of restores it from archive. So, by the way, this first time I forgot how to launch a port, so I'm going to try to do port 4000. It doesn't work, but you'll see that I figured that out in just a beat. But it stores the container, so you can kind of interactively do like a brew install, an apt install, and get it up and running. So now I'll do the open port from the Project IDX menu down at the bottom. And we'll see an older copy of the site the last time I synced it. Again, this is showing it in Project IDX on an ephemeral container running in Google Cloud. So some of the considerations. Project IDX allows some configuration and does store your last container image, but it's not quite the same Docker file, so you don't get to define each and every step. And you can kind of see some of the things I've included here in the packages. And then in DevContainers and Codespaces, they both use this DevContainer folder, and you can see that I have a JSON. I can use a pre-baked image from, I don't know, Microsoft, I guess. But I tend to always define my own in Docker file because I don't trust anybody. And you can see here, actually I'm going to go back one. I defined a bunch of shell scripts. These all engage with my Azure Key Vault where I store secrets. And so what I do is I build up my container, add all my libraries, including things like the latest version of the Azure CLI, Pulumi, because I like to use that, Brew for homebrew, and then I copy all my shell scripts in here. So all my little local scripts that I like to use are in my container ready to go. And again, IDX is free. I saw a confirmation on the IDX website, and I actually talked to that guy we had from Google who came here during our dev days, and he confirmed it. They're just not planning to charge for it right now. Codespaces is part of GitHub Pro, so as a user, it's $4 a month, and I get 180 hours and 20 gigs of storage. So assuming a 5-day week, that's 9 hours a day. That's more than enough to cover your average person. And then you pay a little extra beyond that if you want to keep using beyond 180 hours. And DevContainers is obviously free. You're running it local. So here you can see kind of my current plan, where it's $4 a month, 20 gigs of code space, 180 hours. So you get a lot of stuff, but I don't get Copilot. It's not part of my deal. I have to pay extra for that. So who pays? So when you do Codespaces, when you go to launch it down here, I am on my personal site that I've invited my WellSky user to see. When I'm about to launch a Codespace to it, it does note Codespace usage for this repo is paid for by my WellSky account. So if I share my site, my blog, or my Git repo with other users and they launch Codespaces, they need to pay for it, not me, which is a kind of a good thing because that can freak me out if everybody launching a container burns through all my credits. So how does it work with WellSky? All right, let's switch specifically to WellSky. So it is enabled on our Metaware Inc. account, and we can launch without a defined dev container folder. So here is a Python-based application I've written for doing stuff, and you can see I can create a code space right here on main. When I go to do it, it fires it up. We can see it's opening it remote. I can now, start to follow my own markdown for what my steps are to build up the container. But then what I can also do is say, open it in VisualStudio Code Desktop, which will redirect to VisualStudio Code that was already launched. And it'll say install extension and open URI, which I did, and I authenticated and did the MFA. And now I'm running it in VisualStudio Code locally on my WellSky laptop. And you can even click this little button here on the computer to see the name of it and how many cores and what it's given it for usage. And if I want to go back to it, you can see it's running, it's active, and it makes up its own names. It's called Secret Gravestones, which is kind of fun for Halloween week. Right here. Now, by default, after 30 minutes, they stop the container, so it'll be active like that, making it quick for me to go to, but after half an hour, they'll stop and it has to be started again. And if I ignore these repos, by default, 30 days, they'll be removed. We could also just stop a code space if we're done using it, if we want to just save for charges and time. And that's about it.